Cilj današnje tribine, arhitektura i slobodno zidarstvo, jeste da pruži uvid u arhitekturu slobodnih zidara, takozvanih masona, oslanjajući se prvenstveno na primere iz Sjedinjenih Država. Iako masonerija ima predmoderne korene, najupečatljivije arhitektonske strukture su podignute u godinama između 1870. i 1930. godine. Masonske građevine simbolično predstavljaju Solomonov hram, dok istovremeno obezbeđuju prostor za izvođenje rituala specifičnih za članove organizacije, kao i za iskazivanje vrednosti na kojima organizacija počiva. Pored analize hramova, koji se koriste za prva 3 stepena takozvanog zanatstva masonerije, na tribini će biti reči i o arhitektonskim prostorima škotskog obreda, vitezova templara i mističnog svetilišta. Na predavanju učestvuje profesor dr. William Moore, moderator će biti profesorka doktorka Jelena Erdeljan sa Filozofskog fakulteta Univerziteta u Beogradu. Takođe napomenut ćemo da će predavanje kao i diskusija nakon izlaganja biti na engleskom jeziku, stoga vas pozivamo da se priključite nakon izlaganja profesora Moora, podelite vaše viđenja, poglede i iskoristite priliku da postavite pitanja. Hvala.
Professor Moore, it is my pleasure and a great honor to welcome you to this, actually this cycle of lectures, which now it's your turn to tell us something about architecture and Freemasonry. And indeed, you're probably the best expert, in my opinion, to speak on this subject, by all means. I shall just inform our audience, and your audience as well, of a few words about your professional CV. So Professor William D. Moore holds a joint appointment between the Department of History of Art and Architecture and the American and New England Studies program. An interdisciplinary American Studies scholar, he has specialties in material culture, the built environment, and cultural history. He holds an AB in folklore and mythology from Harvard University, and both an MA and a PhD from the American and New England Studies program at Boston University. He researches, lectures, and publishes on vernacular architecture, folk art, American fraternalism, public history, the interpretation of historic sites, and the history of surfing. He's the author of Shaker Fever, America's 20th Century Fascination with the Communitarian Sect, published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2020, and Masonic Temples, Freemasonry, Ritual Architecture, and Masculine Archetypes, published by the University of Tennessee Press in 2006. He has contributed numerous articles to exhibition catalogs, books, and scholarly journals. He serves on the editorial boards of the journals Winter Thur, Portfolio, and Buildings and Landscapes. He is currently working on a book on the architecture of Cape Cod and its adjacent islands, which will be published by the University of Virginia Press as part of the Society of Architectural Historians Buildings of the United States series. Professor Moore, it is my pleasure now to give you the floor.
Thank you. And I'm going to share my screen. And
yes, we can see it.
okay. Okay, so.
Would you like to put it on slide like the full screen? This is the icon at the bottom register, the icon that is actually close to the volume bar, the first next to it to the left. That small icon that looks like a screen, a rolled up screen.
And after that you can
choose
the right one.
Okay, I'm having a little bit of trouble.
If not, we're perfectly fine with things the way they are. I mean, we can see them because it's projected also on a big screen, not only on a laptop. So I think everyone can see regardless.
Okay. Hold on just a sec. Oh. I'm sorry about this.
Never mind, just take your time. We all have experiences with Zoom during Corona times, so we know how it works, or it doesn't.
Okay. So
There we
can
are.
you see that?
Yes, perfect, thank you. Great.
Okay, all right. And here is, this is the outline of what I want to talk about today, where, I'm going to first talk about what Freemasonry is and where it comes from and its pre-modern roots, so that we have a shared understanding. And along with that, the Solomonic ritual that defines the fraternity. And then I'm going to talk about the spatial aspect of that, where these rituals take place, which is in a space called lodge rooms, where the Masonic rituals play out, where the fraternity really takes physical manifestation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the buildings that are built around these lodge rooms, and then talk about other fraternal groups that grow out of Freemasonry that are kind of branches of Freemasonry, the Knights Templar, the Scottish Rite, and then ending up with Shriners Mosques. And the Shriners Mosques are primarily an American manifestation, but so the amazing thing about Freemasonry is that it's a global movement that starts in the early 18th century. And again, there's lots of discussion about when exactly it starts. Some people say as early as 1590, but it's an organization that grows out of craft guilds. It's originally, it grows out of stonemasons guilds where they have craft rituals where they teach secrets and have bonds that tie them together. And then at the beginning of the 18th century, suddenly there are English gentlemen who want to join this fraternity and start to go through the rituals. And they're no longer actually building buildings. They're now using the stonemasons' tools and the stonemasons' symbols to express ideologies and to talk about ideas of brotherhood and fraternity and egalitarianism. So at the beginning of it, it's very disorganized. And then really the first hard date we have, which again, more recent scholarship has even started to call this into question, is that the Grand Lodge of London is formed by 4 different lodges coming together and cooperating, and they create the Grand Lodge of London in 1717, and then they publish the first book, the first constitutions of the fraternity in 1723, and that's what you see here on the screen, is the first constitutions of Freemasonry. So from this original group of 4 different lodges in London coming together, Freemasonry spreads out to be a global movement. And the fascinating thing about Freemasonry is that even though there are things that are continuities all around the globe, there are also things where any statement you make about Freemasonry in one place can be absolutely false in another place. Freemasonry ends up being very local at the same time that it's international, and it fits and adapts itself to the local culture and the local conditions. So what I'm going to be talking about today is mostly about how it worked in the United States. That's what I know the most about. But again, there will be continuities that are global. Now, the other thing I want to mention at this very beginning is that Freemasonry itself likes to think of itself as one organization, that there is a single Freemasonry. But more recently, scholars have started to use the term Freemasonries, that there are multiple Freemasonries that act in different ways and have different trajectories, different patterns. And this comes from my friend's work on the history of Freemasonry in Latin America, where there are multiple different Freemasonries that are slightly different from each other. So one of the things that is really the continuity that we see from the very beginning is a focus on King Solomon's Temple. And the ritual of Freemasonry that defines the lodges all uses the symbolism and the history of the building of Solomon's Temple as the center of the fraternity. So here's an engraving by Botar from 1750. This is an English engraving. And in it, you see King Solomon with his scepter sitting on the throne in the center. And then the second most important figure in Freemasonry, Hiram, the king of Tyre, you see to the left. And then Hiram Abiff, who is the architect that built the temple, on the right. And these are the three figures around who the Masonic ritual circulates. So they're called the three ancient Grand Masters. But also from this engraving from the 1750s, you can see that some of the Masonic symbolism has already become stabilized. So here we have these two pillars, right, which are supposed to be the pillars on the porch of Solomon's Temple. That's Jachin and Boaz. And then the checkerboard pavement here, which ends up being a tessellated pavement, they call it, that is supposed to symbolize the inner sanctum of Solomon's Temple. And then the three candlesticks, which are called the three great lights of Freemasonry. And these symbols end up being used to teach ideas about the existential quest of being human and of living in society. And so we'll see these symbols over and over again as we go through the lecture. So from England, as I said, Freemasonry spreads across the globe. And again, it's about groups of men, primarily men, although there are lodges that accept women as well, but it's primarily men initiating themselves into the organization and teaching each other the ideology of the organization through the ritual process. So this is an engraving from the 18th century in France showing a man being initiated into the fraternity. You can see here, it says an assembly of Freemasons for the reception of an apprentice. So there are three stages in these initial rituals of Freemasonry: the entered apprentice, the journeyman, and the master mason. And in this scene from a French lodge in the 18th century, you can see here's the master of the lodge who plays the role of King Solomon, sitting at the east of the assembly room, and you can tell he's the master of the lodge because he's wearing a hat, but he also has on the square that's the symbol of his office as the master. And then here on the floor is what's called a tracing board or a trestle board or a master's carpet, which you can see once again symbolizes Solomon's Temple. Here are the two pillars, Jachin and Boaz, and the tessellated pavement. And then here are the symbols of the lodge, and there's the master's square. Right, so this gentleman is being initiated into the lodge. And again, this is what we call speculative Freemasonry, meaning that these are gentlemen who are doing this as a philosophical activity rather than century earlier would have been operative masonry, actual stone masons teaching each other the the lessons of their union, so to speak. And the ideology that they are teaching is linked to the Enlightenment. So ideas about egalitarianism, ideas about individuals' role in society, ideas about self-rule, right? And in this time period, Freemasonry was found to be threatening by both the royalty and the aristocracy and by the Catholic Church, because it threatened the hierarchical structures of those institutions through teaching these Enlightenment principles. So this is a British engraving from 1735, and it's a list of the lodges that are associated with the Grand Lodge of London. So you can see the spread. We talked about 1717, there were 4 lodges in London. By 1735, you've got all of these different lodges, including number 126 in this engraving is in Boston in New England, right? So it's spreading to the British colonies, and at the same time, it's also spreading around the globe to Europe, to South America, and it ends up, Freemasonry ends up being particularly strong any place that the British Empire has forces stationed. So Freemasonry spread in North America through the British occupation, but also through the elite gentlemen who want to find a way to be linked back to London. You know, the wealthy planters in Virginia who see themselves as British gentlemen, even though they're in Virginia, like to have linked to the imperial center in London, and Freemasonry provides that center. So throughout the spread of the spread of the British Empire, you end up having Freemasonry in India, in the Middle East, in Palestine, anywhere the British are, you end up having Masonic organizations. So showing the spread of Freemasonry to North America, I wanted to just show you, these are 2 ritual paintings that are in the collection at the Grand Lodge of New York. And you can see that they're quite similar to the tracing board that I showed you from London, from France in the 18th century. These are from probably 1790 to 1810. And again, in each case, you can see that you have these pillars that are the pillars on the post, on the porch of Solomon, right? And again, you've got the sun and the moon, the all-seeing eye, right? And the G, which stands for the grand architect of the universe. So this is all linked to enlightenment. You know, the deity is referred to as the grand architect, the person that designs the temple that all men are building. And I want to call attention to these 2 symbols here. This is the rough ashlar that comes from the quarries, right? And you can see it's not good to build with, right? It's got rough edges, no right angles. You could not build a temple using this rough ashlar, right? But on the other side of the painting, the perfect ashlar, which has the plain sides and the right angles. So this is a man in his natural state. This is a man after he's been improved by Freemasonry. And again, the tools here of the Mason are what are being used to create a man as a perfect ashlar so that society can be built with him. So this is all images of the individual's role in society. How do you build a democratic organization? How do you build an egalitarian society that is that practices self-rule, right? And in North America, Freemasonry becomes kind of a civic religion in the time period of the new American Republic. And George Washington, who you see here in a portrait taken from life in his Masonic regalia, is in many ways idolized in the United States as the ultimate perfect ashlar, the man who is thinking about the good of the nation rather than his own self-interest. You know, he steps down from being the general of the Continental Army, and it turns down the opportunity to become the king of North America. He later becomes elected president, but after 2 terms, he once again steps down so that somebody else can take the rule. So again, this idea of what we come to think of as Republican virtue, that people can work together and they can give over power, that there can be a peaceful transition of power. And Freemasonry is kind of where George Washington and other Americans had understood this idea of self-rule while they were still subjects of the British monarchy. So Freemasonry plays its role in American society by teaching how self-government can happen. So with these rituals, they end up being held in this time period in a variety of different settings. They're not necessarily being held in specific Masonic spaces. Frequently, they're held in coffee houses. They're also held in taverns. But then also these rituals can take place in spaces in the homes of prominent people. So this is an example. It's called the Salem Town House. It's named after a man named Salem Town. So this is a little bit confusing because sometimes you talk about a townhouse as being a space that's owned by a municipality, but this is actually a house that's named after a man named Salem Town. And on the 2nd floor of his house, he was a Mason, and he created a space where the Masonic rituals could take place. So in this plastered room, you see on the walls the tall cedars of Lebanon. These are references to the cedars that are used in the construction of Solomon's temple. But you can also see here on the ceiling the all-seeing eye and the stars, right, of the Masonic ceremony, right? So this is the first example I'm showing you of Masonry and architecture. It's a space that's been modified for the Masonic ritual, but it's not designed specifically for it. In upstate New York, this lodge building was built in 1820, and DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor of New York, who also was an active and important Freemason, he ceremonially lays the cornerstone for this building, which at this point, this is kind of out in the provinces. This is not a very developed part of the state, but they have enough men that they build this lodge building to have their lodge room in. And you can see it's built in kind of a neoclassical Georgian or Adamesque style, with these wonderful fans and the fan light over the door. But once again, here we've got the temples, the pillars from Solomon's temple on the front, and the G showing that it's a Masonic space, the grand architect of the universe. But this arch with the keystone also symbolizes that there is another set of rituals that are going on here. This is the 4th ritual of Freemasonry. It's called the Royal Arch degree. So you've got the entered apprentice, the journeyman, the master mason, and then this is the Royal Arch, which is the beginning of an expansion of degrees that we see throughout the 19th century. There are more and more different rituals being developed that are added on to Freemasonry. So in this time period, as I said, with George Washington, many of the elites in American society are Freemasons, and At the same time, there's also an evangelical Christian movement taking place in American society, the Second Great Awakening, which is concerned with that Freemasonry might be becoming a new aristocracy, and they also see Freemasonry as a threat to evangelical Christianity. So there's a movement in American society called the anti-Masonic movement, in which there's both political and religious suppression of Freemasonry. So this is a pamphlet that was produced in 1831 as part of this suppression of Freemasonry. And it's wonderful. I'm showing it to you because it's got this cartoon, which is showing a man, once again, being initiated, kneeling at the altar with his hands on the square and compass. And yet these people are the opposite of gentlemen. They're ruffians, and they're having this ritual not done in a place of respect or privilege. Instead, it's being done up in an attic. And I love these little rats running here along the beam, showing how disreputable the Masons are, having their secret ceremonies up in this attic. So the anti-Masonic movement really plays a major role, and many of the lodges, a majority of the lodges in the country go out of business in the 1830s and 1840s. And starting in the 1850s, Freemasonry starts to revive itself. And in this time period, the lodge rooms become more formalized, and the rituals become more formalized. And also at this time, the American Industrial Revolution is taking place, which means that there's more goods available. The nation is wealthier, so there's more money to be spent on Masonic regalia, Masonic supplies. And so there's a real golden era of Freemasonry that starts to develop in the 1850s, really comes together in the 1870s, and stretches through to 1930, when the Great Depression changes the world again. And during this period, you end up having specific rooms that are built to hold the lodge rituals. So these are purpose-built lodge rooms. And here on the left, I'm showing you a representation of one of these lodge rooms. And here again, you've got the master of the lodge sitting up on three platforms. This is called the east of the lodge, right? And here's the letter G that's always in the east. And again, he's playing the role of King Solomon, right? And then this is an altar, which you see in the center of all lodge rooms. And this is where members who are being initiated take their oaths of membership. And you see here on the right, this is an image of the man taking his oath on the Bible. And again, here part of the ritual is that he's on what's called a cable toe, and he's got his hands on the square and compass on the Bible. And if we just go back for a minute, you can see this is the same image. Here he is at the altar with the cable toe, with his hands on the square and compass, right? It's just that the representation here is making it look elevated and important, as opposed to that mimicry of it that was taking place in the earlier image. And then around the altar, you've got space, what came to be called floor work, which is the acting out of the Masonic ritual, right? And part of the ritual, the story of the ritual, is the murder of Hiram Abiff, the architect of Solomon's Temple, being hit with a setting maul, right? So here we see a mid-19th century image of this action of the murder of Hiram Abiff by ruffians using a setting maul. And that would be taking place in this space around the altar. So in lodge rooms, you frequently have, or you always have, seating around the exterior of the room facing in towards the altar, and open space in the center for this floor work to be done. And the men who are making up the membership of the lodge are sitting around the lodge room, watching it take place. So it's kind of theater in the round, where they're seeing the actions of the fraternity, of the ritual, at the same time that they're also seeing the faces of their brothers on the other side of the room. So in this period that I'm talking about, the golden age of Freemasonry in the United States, every town in the United States has a Masonic lodge room, and they all have this same floor plan with the seating around the exterior of the lodge, the master in the east with the G over his head, the altar in the center, and then here we've got the three great lights of Freemasonry around the altar. And some of them become extremely elaborate. You know, they can just be a space in a rented room above a store or above a bank. They're always on a second or third floor. They don't tend to be on the street floor, but they can also become very elaborate in kind of palaces in the major American cities. So here I'm just showing you an example of one lodge room from the Masonic Temple in Philadelphia that's built in the 1870s, and then they've got an interior decorator named George Herzog, who comes through and decorates the different lodge rooms in different styles. And because Freemasonry tried to identify itself with the building of Solomon's Temple in the Middle East, you know, there was an idea of antiquity. So many of the lodge rooms ended up being decorated in this Egyptian revival style, like this spectacular example in Philadelphia. So I mentioned that this is taking place in the period of industrialization in the United States, where materials are becoming cheaper and goods are becoming more easily accessible. So in the end of the 19th century, these rituals end up being done in costumes. And there's an entire industry that develops to provide ritual costumes for the Masons to do their rituals. So here you see on the left, the ritual team of Norseman Lodge, number 878 in Brooklyn, in their ritual costumes. And again, notice here's King Solomon in the center. And then these are images from a ritual paraphernalia catalog from the American Midwest from the early 20th century. So no matter where you lived in the country, you could write in an order to get these ritual costumes sent to you. So the buildings that held the Masonic ritual rooms came to be identified with Solomon's Temple, because the lodge room is the place where Solomon's rituals are taking place. So many of the buildings have architecturally added to them pillars on the facade. So these are Yachin and Boaz, the Masonic pillars on the front of this example in El Dorado, Arkansas, designed by Charles S. Watts. And again, you know, particularly after you had the Egyptomania of King Tut's tomb being discovered, people love the Egyptian symbolism. So again, you can see that you've got here a mishmash of Masonic symbolism and Egyptian revival symbolism. And then here's a couple of other wonderful examples. These two in St. Louis, Missouri, on the left, built Mount Moriah Masonic Temple, and again, that Mount Moriah is a reference to the location of Solomon's Temple. And again, these wonderful pillars on the front, these Egyptian pillars, and then on the right, again, this one amazingly is now a temple of Scientology. You know, the Masons sold it, and the Scientologists loved the architecture, so they bought it. And you've got this fabulous ziggurat roof, as well as these lotus-topped columns on the facade and identifying it as Solomon's Temple. So this idea of the importance of Solomon and the imagery of Solomon leaks out of Freemasonry and ends up kind of permeating American society. So I just wanted to show you these two wonderful windows by the Tiffany Studios that were produced showing Solomon in stained glass, right? So kind of a two-dimensional representation. And the one on the left, Edward J. Simmons, this is a memorial to a man who was the Grand Master of Masons in the state of New York. So during his life, he had kind of played the role of Solomon. So in this memorial window, Tiffany has portrayed him as Solomon in his robes and in splendor. The one on the right is in a private collection, the Dry House collection, but we don't know what the provenance is of it. But it's obviously, again, the same design made by Tiffany for another client. And then this is a mausoleum built by a group of Masons outside Kansas City, Missouri, completed in 1927. And once again, obviously referencing Solomon's Temple, right? So this is a mausoleum so that Masons could spend eternity buried in a mausoleum that spoke to their Masonic membership and that spoke to their linkages to the Solomonic tradition. And if you go inside it, you'll find that it has a lodge room in the center of it, so that when the Masons were buried in this mausoleum, they could be sent off onto the other side with Masonic rituals within a Masonic lodge room. All right, so I mentioned that there are other Masonic groups that grow out of these three, the three basic rituals. Those three rituals are sometimes referred to as craft masonry or Blue Lodge masonry. And starting in the 18th century, there are esoteric ideas that kind of circle around Freemasonry, which then in the 19th century take form and become physical manifestations. And one of these is the idea of the Knights Templar, right? And the Knights Templar, starting in the 18th century in France, there were Masons who didn't like the idea that Freemasonry came out of the working class. They wanted it to be more aristocratic than that. So they started to claim that Freemasonry had its roots in the holy warriors of the Crusades. And so there's this military aspect of Freemasonry, which manifests itself after the American Civil War in the United States. And you start to have groups of Masons that are having armories and drill halls and dressing in uniform and having kind of a military aspect. Well, this is a different aspect of masculinity that's being expressed, rather than the masculinity of being a laborer, of being an artisan. This is being a holy warrior. And here on the left, you see a floor plan that shows these lockers where the Masonic uniforms could be stored in between when they're not meeting. And on the right, this floor plan of the Troy, New York Masonic Temple from 1874. And you can see that this is the upper level. This is a 2-story lodge room, right? And then F is the banquet hall, right? And then I here is the drill hall, where the Knights Templar were able to practice their martial drilling and marching in uniform. And then C is where the lockers were and where where the uniforms were kept. And here are the Knights Templar out in public, marching in their uniforms, ready to protect Christianity, to protect righteousness. You know, this is the kind of military wing of Freemasonry. So also, you had another group of Masons that developed in the 19th century that was called the Scottish Rite. Again, even though it's called Scottish, it's actually of French origin, the écossais, right, and claiming kind of a primitivism that's linked to Scotland. And the Scottish Rite was linked into the esoteric revival of the 19th century with Eliphas Levi in Paris and ideas of Rosicrucianism. And they had a series of 33 degrees, which originally were held in individuals being initiated in lodge rooms with many different kinds of material culture associated with it. But over time, these rituals started to be presented in theatrical representations where instead of having a single man initiated at a time, you would have numerous men initiated, and instead of having lodge rooms with lots of different ornamentation, they started to present the rituals theatrically. And you had scenery that was developed by theatrical supply companies that gave you romantic and esoteric spaces. And instead of going through the ritual yourself, you paid money and watched a theatrical presentation and learned the ritual ideas in these spaces. And the fraternal organizations loved this because it meant that they could make a lot of money by charging people to watch these theatrical presentations. So they built larger and larger auditoriums. You see this one from Fort Wayne, Indiana from 1915 on the left. And here are some examples, some more examples of these esoteric, wonderful theatrical backdrops. On the left is scenery of Solomon's temple in Kansas City. And on the right is an image that's kind of a salesman's sample that people that were selling the scenery would take and say, this is the kind of imagery that we can produce for you. And this culminates in huge temples. So this is one of the largest built in the country in the United States. This is in St. Louis, designed by the architect William Ittner, completed in 1924, and it seated 3,000 people. So again, if they're all paying, initiation fees, this is a huge amount of money that the fraternity can make by charging people to be initiated in these huge auditoriums. So the Knights Templar and the Scottish Rite both have European roots. The final one I'm going to talk about is the Shriners. And I think the Shriners are only in North America. They're in the United States, but they're also in Mexico and Canada. And they developed starting in the 1870s, and they claim to be a playground of Freemasonry, where the Blue Lodge rituals and the Knights Templar and the Scottish Rite, they were all about righteousness and correct behavior. The Shriners used what they saw as being Arab or Middle Eastern imagery as a way to get away from the strictures of Judeo-Christian morality. And they pretended to be Arabs as a way to behave in ways that they wouldn't necessarily expect to, that they took on a different ideology. And here you see the leader of Mecca Temple in New York City. This is from about 1890 on the left. And then all the leaders of Denver's El Jebel Temple from the 1920s. And here they believed in sensuality and consumption and dancing girls, right? And they started to build temples in which they could laugh and have a good time and come together. And again, these temples that they built had neo-Moorish or Arab architectural identification. On the left is Lulu Temple in Philadelphia, and on the right is the floor plan of Kismet Temple in Brooklyn. And what I wanted to point out to you here is that this is, again, the same Masonic lodge room, except expanded significantly. right? Instead of holding 40 or 50 people, this is a huge space holding, again, up to 1,000 people. But again, everybody looking at where the ritual is going to take place. But it's a ritual that has different ideology than the original lodge room. And here is, again, an example. This one's in New Orleans from 1918, designed by one of the city's leading architects, Emile Weil. And here I am visiting it in this is me last year in New Orleans. And again, you can see it's got a stage, right, just like the worshipful master up on the east. And it's got the seating around the outside, but it still has this open space in which the ritual can take place, in which the Shriners are initiated into their space, right? But again, these become these fantasy realms in which American men can move away from the way they've been brought up. They can pretend to be somebody else. They can practice a new 20th century morality of consumption and of leisure through the shrine. All right, so that's my presentation. And again, so we've got the prehistoric or the pre-modern roots in 17th and 18th century Britain, which then translates around the world with spaces developed to the lodge room that then end up being built into Masonic temples that represent Solomon's temple. But then you also have these other pre-Masonic orders that have different masculine identities of the Knights Templar, the Holy Warrior, the Scottish Rite being the wise man or the initiated, and then Shriners mosques where they pretend to be somebody that they're not. And then finally, I just want to say all of this is more fully developed than I was able to do today in my book, Masonic Temples, which you can get online from Amazon or other sources. So with that, I hope I haven't bowled you over or confused you, but I'm more than happy to open the floor to conversation and questions if you have them.
Thank you, Professor Moore. I think we should really give you a big applause because you have really fascinated us with these, with all the information that you gave us, the systematic treatment of the information, and also with all the imagery that you showed us. Most of us, I'm an art historian, but to me also this was something very new. Some of the things I knew, but most of the things I didn't know, including the Shriners, which I'm fascinated by that. As somebody who lived in the Middle East, for example, so I could relate to, to the Shriners' aesthetics. And I'm sure that our public here, our audience here, has quite a number of questions. So I give the floor now to any of you who have any questions or comments. In case you're, in case you'd like to speak Serbian, I could translate. So I think we could also work that way in case members of the audience are shy to speak English.
Okay, Mr. Moore. My name is Branko, I'm from Serbia. I have a few questions. You said in the beginning that Masonry is local and international. But if Masonry has nice objectives and something good, but if those things get lost in translation, like we saw in the Lulu temple, how do people could believe in those things? Like in those pictures, they were laughing to Masonry because some people are doing those things like we saw in that picture. If you could make an answer on that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Can somebody use a microphone to make it more more accessible to me?
We have been using a microphone, but perhaps I could ask you to come up here to the question is quite elaborate, actually, and it has a point. It's not only a question, but there's a point that you want to make. So I think that you could, here.
Okay, Mr. Moore, do you hear me now?
Can you hear, Professor?
No.
No? Can you hear me when I speak?
I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'm going to give my microphone to our guest and see if...
Okay, Mr. Moore, do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. On the beginning of the lecture, you said that Masonry is local and internationally based, like on the beginning. But if those things get lost in translation, like we saw in that Lulu temple, how do people will believe in those things that it has good intentions and everything? Because in those pictures, the people are laughing to it, because those things are looking silly, those things like the dancers and everything else.
Right. So yes, the Shriners are what we would now call, politically incorrect. In that time period, the Americans did not understand the basis or did not have good understanding of Muslim culture. There were not a lot of Muslims in the United States in that time period. So I kind of say that for Americans at that time, dressing up as people from the Middle East might as well have been dressing up as Martians. They never thought that they would actually meet them, right? And so this is a real problem, that they're building these temples that are representing mosque, and yet they're using them for very different purposes. I mean, and where this kind of centers is alcohol, right? That the Shriners are drinking all the time in these buildings at the same time that, that alcohol is not part of Muslim culture. So there is that problem, right? But it also follows that, from the very beginning, when they're dressing up and pretending to be the men that are building Solomon's temple, they're once again taking on a different identity, right? And when they're dressing up to be the Knights Templar, they're once again leaving their identity as American men of the industrial period. And as I showed you in that slide, they're seeing themselves as being the Crusaders from the Middle Ages. So all of this is to some extent about fantasy and dressing up and playing out it being other identities. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, I understand. Okay, the second question is about architecture in Belgrade. Have you been in Belgrade?
I have not.
In Belgrade, there is a few buildings with Masonry architecture, like a natural museum in the center in Kalemegdan of Fortress. We didn't have luck like in America, so those buildings are now changed by their usage and everything. Have you ever in your books studied the things like, because the moment when Masonry architecture is flourishing, the countries in the same time are having economic boost. Growth. Have you ever studied about those things?
Well, mostly my work has focused on the United States. I know a little bit about Masonic activities in other parts of the world. And, again, as I mentioned, there's that anti-Masonry period in the United States in the 1830s when there's forces that arraign themselves against the fraternity because they're afraid that it's got too much power or that it's organizing people. And throughout world history, there are time periods in which different groups become very anti-Masonic. For example, the Nazis believed that Freemasons and Jews were conspiring to take over the world. so that there was great suppression of Freemasonry by the Third Reich in the middle of the 20th century.
Okay, okay, thanks. I have just one more question. Could you give us some idea in which books we could find some direct answers about those knowledges and everything? Do you have those in your book, or?
About Freemasonry in Serbia?
No, Freemasonry
I
and
know that there was
architecture also. Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
in
about Masonic architecture?
yeah, I understand that, but do you have referred on the history buildings and everything, so we could read some more also from your book and other things?
So I think I have to say, I think my book is the place to start.
Nice. I understand that. Thanks. Thanks for your question.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for your answers. I also have a question. Having spent a lot of time in Jerusalem myself, of course, I've been to the fabled American Colony Hotel, which used to be the American Colony in Jerusalem. And do you have any knowledge about the contact, perhaps, of these American Freemasons? Did they ever go there? Did they have any contact with those people who were there at the American colony, who were there actually to evangelize, to spread the word of the gospel, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, there were a lot of Masons that did, we might even call them pilgrimages, tourist traps or tourist visits to Jerusalem. And there's lots of souvenirs that got brought back to the United States that are carved out of stone that pretend to be from the quarries where Solomon's Temple was, where the stone from where Solomon's Temple came from. But that's something that has not been adequately studied yet. There's a man named Paul Rich who has done some work about kind of international Masonic. There are a few different books that are now about the bonds of empire and how Freemasonry was used to support the British Empire. So there is a literature about that, but it tends to be more political. It doesn't tend to do architecture. Yes. It doesn't do architectural analysis.
I can imagine, yes, yes. Also, another thing that I noticed, and I'm sure that other art historians, if there are any in the audience, have also noticed that the neo-Moorish style of the mosques, quote unquote, it's very curious to see that in Central Europe, for example, many synagogues that were built at the turn of the century, the end of the 19th, especially by Lippert Baumhorn and other people, famous architects, Jewish architects of synagogues in Central Europe, they relied on practically the same, how shall I say, the same choice of motifs, of these neo-Moorish motifs that they combined in practically the same way as the Shriners did in their mosques, quote unquote. So it's quite, we had a synagogue here in Belgrade that was unfortunately destroyed in World War II in one of the central streets of Belgrade that practically looked very similar. The front of the facade of the synagogue Bet Israel in Kralja Petra Street in central Belgrade used to look very similar to the Lulu Temple in Philadelphia. So here's another aspect of the whole thing that I think for us in Belgrade is quite interesting. So
yes,
thank you for this.
Throughout the United States, you have synagogues that are also using this architectural vocabulary to distinguish themselves.
Well, thank you. Fascinating. Are there any more questions? Any other questions? Anybody else that would like to talk with Professor Moore? Ali, Ja vas molim da ipak dođete ovde, lakše je. Molim vas, nemojte da zamerite. Ne može da vas čuje. There is another question, but he has to come up to this microphone by which I'm sitting and...
Please, Professor, what is about contemporary buildings in USA, especially maybe in New York or elsewhere? Washington, for example.
So
I only heard the last...
Masonic buildings.
I'm sorry?
We had a question here regarding contemporary Masonic structures built at this moment, so contemporary Masonic structures in the USA that you know of. What do they look like?
Well, in the contemporary period, in the present, the socioeconomic status of Masons and the wealth that the Masons have is not near what it was 100 years ago. So many of these old temples are being lost. They can't afford to maintain them. And they have either gone back to renting spaces in other buildings, or they are building relatively modest structures on the outskirts of cities where there's lots of parking. Parking has become an important thing in American culture. So people want to be able to park near where they're going. So many of these buildings in the city centers don't have adequate parking. So more frequently in the present, the buildings are relatively modest, one-story brick structures with parking around the exterior of them.
Thank you. So parking rules supreme, as we are witnessing also here in Belgrade. It's practically taking over, cars are taking over life. So are there any other questions? There is another question, but it's in Serbian, so I'm going to try and translate. Okay, we have a question from Branko. This is the person who addressed you first with quite a number of questions. He has another question regarding the similarities between, okay, we know about Yahin and Boaz and their symbolic meaning, but he also says that both Catholic and Orthodox churches often have these two pillars and often have this, of course, they all have the sanctuary and they all have the altar space. And could there be any comparison drawn between a Masonic temple or a well, that's a, yeah, he's asking about the comparison between Solomon's temple, and yes, the answer is of course yes, the church and Solomon's temple are in direct connection. We also had, but I'm sure that also from the Masonic point of view, is there any sort of specific stance that the Masonic architecture takes towards church architecture? Does it quote from church architecture? Is there any direct connection?
Well, the best answer I can give you is that when I started doing research on this, I found that there were companies in the United States in the 1880s, 1890s that realized that there was a market for furniture for Masonic lodge rooms. So they started to produce Masonic furniture, and they started to produce, as I showed you, catalogs to sell Masonic furniture. And what I found is that they had parallel catalogs, and in one catalog they would call it lodge furniture, and they would have there's lodge chair number 4, and in the other catalog, which was aimed at churches, it would say pulpit chair number 4, and it was exactly the same chair. You're right.
So an excellent answer to this question, yes. We get the picture. Right. Fantastic. Okay. Okay, any other questions? So if not, we could draw this wonderful evening to a close. Not an evening at your place, but evening here. And we would like to thank you for taking part and for addressing our audience and for broadening the spectrum of our knowledge, not only on these Masonic lodges and the architecture of Freemasonry, but actually you introduced us to an aspect of both life and visual culture in the United States in the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th century. We thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So now, because you're the host of this meeting, you can now bring it to a close. I mean, Zoom-wise.
Okay.
Hope to see you in person.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a
Bye.
good day. Bye.